Final since Canada, Mexico, and the U.S.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said
Canada with tariffs because of the
in the United States for unfair.
States tariff dispute has already cost an average Canadian household, and it arrives just as President Donald Trump's administration prepares another significant escalation. On Monday, the administration announced a plan to apply a 50% tariff on a range of additional Canadian goods, with the measures set to take effect in under 30 days. Hockey sticks, cement, alcoholic beverages, and non-alcoholic beverages are among the products named. The central question now is whether Canada's Prime Minister and the American President can reach an agreement before that deadline arrives, and what happens to household budgets if they cannot. Let me take you through exactly what was announced, because the details matter more than the headline figure. The plan announced on Monday would place a 50% tariff on an array of Canadian goods entering the United States. According to the information available, these new measures would cover roughly 500 additional products. In value terms, that represents approximately 5% of Canadian exports, or about $28 billion worth of goods. That is the scale we are discussing, not the entire trading relationship, but a meaningful and clearly defined slice of it, layered on top of tariffs that are already in place from earlier rounds of this dispute.
How big a deal this is?
This is a surprisingly big deal, actually. And it's fitting this is part of your series on the...
The timing is a critical part of the story. These tariffs are not enforced today. They are scheduled to come into effect in less than 30 days, and the American announcement made clear that the window is conditional. If an agreement can be reached between the Canadian Prime Minister and the American President within that period, the measures may not proceed as planned. That distinction matters enormously. What we are looking at right now is an announced plan with a deadline attached, not a completed action. Between now and that date, there is room for negotiation, adjustment, delay, or escalation, and it is not yet clear which of those paths this will follow. Now, what reason did American officials give for the decision? The justification offered points to several specific Canadian policies. American officials cited provincial bans on the sale of United States alcohol, Canada's supply management system for certain agricultural sectors, and quotas affecting American automobiles.
On top of that, these tariffs are going to go into effect. Why is that significant? Because this is a totally new way to impose tariffs. We have not seen...
Taken together, the administration has framed these as unfair trade practices, and it has presented the new tariffs as a way of holding Canada accountable for them. I want to be careful with the language here. That framing is the position of the United States government. It is a claim advanced by one party in a trade dispute, and Canadian authorities have consistently viewed the same policies very differently. Let me explain what those three grievances actually refer to, because they are not abstract complaints. They are specific and long-standing. Start with the alcohol issue. In Canada, the sale and distribution of beverage alcohol is largely controlled at the provincial level, and during earlier phases of this trade dispute, several provinces removed American products from their shelves. For an American producer trying to sell into the Canadian market, losing access to a provincial retail system is not a minor inconvenience. It can mean losing an entire market at once. That is why alcohol has featured so prominently in the American complaint. And it is also why alcoholic beverages appear on the list of Canadian goods, now facing the proposed 50% tariff. The symmetry there is difficult to miss. Supply management is the second grievance, and it deserves a clear explanation. Supply management is a Canadian system that governs production in certain agricultural sectors, most notably dairy, poultry, and eggs. It works by matching domestic production to domestic demand, setting prices to cover producer costs, and controlling how much foreign product can enter before higher tariff rates apply.
Talked about, Tom, but it is still a very active issue.
Monica, always busy where you are. Thank you very much.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news.
Supporters argue it delivers stability and protects family farms from volatile global price swings. American producers have long argued that it limits their access to Canadian consumers. This disagreement is decades old, and it has surfaced in nearly every major trade negotiation between the two countries. The third item concerns quotas on American cars.
on any level. We are neighbors, friends, allies. Just a note for some of you, we do get nailed by these tariffs as much as you do. Our costs have skyrocketed.
Automotive trade sits at the very center of the Canada-United States economic relationship, with vehicles and components crossing the border repeatedly during assembly. Any restriction on that flow, in either direction, tends to draw immediate attention because of how deeply integrated the industry has become. American officials have pointed to Canadian quota arrangements as a barrier. What the available information does not tell us is how much movement, if any, Canada might be willing to offer on that specific point. That brings us to the numbers that most viewers will care about most directly, and I want to walk through them carefully because they are frequently misquoted. According to the estimates being cited, Canadian households have already absorbed roughly $2,300 to $2,700 in additional costs since the tariffs came into effect. That figure is cumulative. It describes what has accumulated over the course of this dispute, not a projection of what is still to come. It is also an estimate produced by economists working with models and assumptions, not a receipt that any individual household can pull out of a drawer. Some families will have absorbed considerably more than that, depending on what they buy. Others will have absorbed considerably less. On the American side of the border, the picture is comparable in scale, but framed differently. Estimates suggest that the tariff measures are costing the average United States household between $1,400 and $2,400 per year, and that figure is expressed in Canadian dollars. Separately, a fact sheet produced by Democrats on the Joint Economic Committee in the United States Congress reported that American consumers paid more than $230 billion in tariff costs passed down to them between February of last year and January of this year, which works out to an average of about 1,700 United States dollars per family.
Some game-changing numbers. Thank you so much for that, Linda.
You're welcome.
I want to pause on that source for a moment, because attribution matters. The $230 billion figure and the $1,700 per family average come from a document produced by Democratic members of a congressional committee. That is a partisan source in a highly contested political environment, and viewers are entitled to weigh it accordingly. What makes it notable is not that it settles the argument, but that it lands in a similar range to the independent estimates being discussed. When numbers from different sources converge, that convergence is worth noting, even when each individual number carries its own limitations. There is a technical point here that shapes everything else in this story, and it is worth stating plainly. A tariff is a tax collected by a government on imported goods, and it is paid by the importer, not by the exporting country. When the United States applies a 50% tariff on a Canadian product, an American business pays that charge when the product crosses the border. What happens next determines who ultimately bears the cost.
Is discriminating against American products. And Trump has, for better or worse, and in some cases better, he has used America's.
The importer may pass it on to retailers and consumers through higher prices, absorb part of it by accepting a thinner margin, press the Canadian supplier to reduce its price, or stop buying the product altogether and look for an alternative. In practice, the burden is usually shared, and that is precisely why estimates of household cost vary so widely. Economists have to make judgments about how much of the tariff gets passed through to shelf prices, how quickly it happens, whether buyers switch to substitutes, and how currency movements affect the final figure. Change any of those assumptions, and the household number moves. That is not a flaw in the analysis. It is an honest reflection of how difficult it is to trace a border charge all the way to a family's monthly spending. So when you hear $2,700, treat it as the upper edge of a reasonable range rather than a precise measurement. So who is most exposed if these new measures proceed as announced? Look at the product list and the pattern becomes clearer. Cement is a construction input, which means the effect would be felt by builders, contractors, and eventually by anyone paying for a project that depends on imported materials. Beverages, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic, are consumer goods sold in high volume, where price changes tend to appear on shelves relatively quickly. Hockey sticks sit in a different category altogether, one that carries obvious cultural weight in Canada and is difficult to ignore in either country. Together, these products suggest a list designed to be noticed rather than one assembled quietly. For Canadian exporters, the immediate concern is straightforward. A 50% tariff can price a product out of its market entirely, depending on the margins involved and how easily American buyers can find alternatives. Firms that have built their business around cross-border sales may face decisions about production levels, staffing, and whether to seek customers elsewhere.
Families, particularly in the U.S., Canada stands ready to engage intensively to address outstanding issues with the U.S. to the mutual benefit of our.
Firms that supply components rather than finished goods face additional uncertainty because they may not know how their customers will respond further down the chain. None of that is confirmed to be happening yet.
Existing free trade agreement. He's literally got 14 pages of different goods that he's now imposing his 50% tariff on, which is a tax on Americans who buy.
The measures have not taken effect, and companies are still assessing what the announcement means. For American businesses and consumers, the exposure runs in the other direction. An American importer buying Canadian cement or Canadian beverages would be the party writing the check for the tariff. That is why the estimates showing costs to United States households exist at all. Trade restrictions in an integrated economy rarely fall neatly on one side. The two economies are connected through supply chains that were built over decades on the assumption that goods would move across the border with minimal friction, and unwinding that assumption creates costs in both directions. The political dimension adds another layer. In the United States, the administration has presented this approach as a way of correcting what it describes as unfair treatment of American producers and of pressing Canada toward changes it has long sought. In Canada, provincial governments have already demonstrated a willingness to respond with measures of their own, as the alcohol decisions show. That creates a difficult dynamic, because each response can be cited by the other side as further justification for escalation. American officials pointed to provincial alcohol bans as a reason for the new tariffs, and those bans were themselves a response to earlier trade measures. Which raises the question I suspect many viewers are asking: is a deal actually likely before the deadline? I cannot answer that, and I would be misleading you if I pretended otherwise. What the available information establishes is that the measures are scheduled to take effect in under 30 days, and that they are set to proceed unless an agreement is reached between the Canadian Prime Minister and the American President within that window. Whether formal talks are underway, at what level, and on what terms has not been detailed in the information available. Officials have not confirmed a negotiating timetable. That gap between an announced deadline and a confirmed process is one of the most important unresolved elements of this story. Let me also be precise about what has and has not been decided, because this distinction gets lost quickly in coverage of trade disputes. What has been announced is a plan. The tariffs have a stated rate of 50%, a stated scope of roughly 500 products worth about $28 billion in Canadian exports, and a stated effective date under 30 days away. What has not happened is implementation. Until these measures are actually in force, the announcement functions as both a policy step and a negotiating position, and it is entirely possible for the final outcome to differ from the initial announcement in rate, scope, or timing. There is also a broader economic question underneath all of this. Tariff costs do not arrive as a single visible line on a receipt. They filter into prices gradually and unevenly, which is part of why they are politically complicated. A family may notice that certain goods cost more without connecting that increase to a trade decision made months earlier in another capital. That diffusion is exactly why the household estimates we have been discussing exist. Economists produce them to make a dispersed cost legible. They are useful as a measure of scale, but they are not a bill anyone receives. I would add one more caution about comparing the Canadian and American figures directly. The Canadian estimate of $2,300 to $2,700 describes accumulated costs since the tariffs began. The American estimate of $1,400 to $2,400 Canadian dollars is expressed as an annual figure. Those are different measurements over different periods, and stacking them side by side without noting the difference can create a misleading impression.
$4.41 billion to be exact. And then why this is so high is because just the value of some of these electronics that we're sending south.
Both point to a real and substantial burden. They simply do not describe the same thing, and precision here is worth the extra sentence. What stands out to me about this particular round is the choice of scope. 5% of Canadian exports is significant without being comprehensive. It is large enough to create genuine pressure on specific sectors and to generate a political response, yet it stops well short of the full trading relationship. That structure is consistent with a measure intended to prompt movement at the negotiating table. Whether it produces that movement is a separate question, and one that will not be answered for several weeks. For Canadians watching this unfold, the practical questions are immediate.
That the trade relationship has been a bit rocky with Canada, and so they were looking at all of those different things. But what's interesting, Tom, is that yesterday President Trump was actually with Prime Minister Mark Carney.
Will prices rise on specific goods? Will employers in exposed industries change their plans? Will provincial governments respond with further measures of their own? None of those outcomes can be stated as fact today. The tariffs have not taken effect, no new provincial response has been confirmed in the information available, and companies have not announced decisions.
He believes tariffs are not used enough. He believes tariffs give him economic leverage, but also diplomatic and negotiating leverage. I assume that's part of what's going on here as well. That was his attitude.
What can be said is that the exposure is real and identifiable, and that the affected sectors are now visible on a published list. For Americans, the questions run parallel. Businesses that rely on Canadian inputs face the prospect of higher costs on roughly 500 products, and those costs would land on American importers first. Some will absorb them, some will pass them along, some will search for alternative suppliers, which takes time and may not be possible at comparable quality or price. The existing estimates of American household costs from earlier tariff rounds provide a rough sense of how these effects have accumulated so far. There is a legal and institutional dimension worth keeping in view as well. Trade measures of this kind can be challenged, adjusted, phased in, or exempted for particular products or industries. Exemption processes are common in tariff policy, and they frequently reshape the practical effect of an announcement after the fact. Whether any exemptions will apply to this round has not been specified in the information available. That is another element to watch as the effective date approaches. So where does that leave the picture as it stands right now? The confirmed elements are these. On Monday, the Trump administration announced a plan for a 50% tariff on an array of Canadian goods, covering roughly 500 products representing about 5% of Canadian exports, or approximately $28 billion in value. The stated justification points to provincial bans on American alcohol, Canada's supply management system, and quotas on American automobiles. The measures are scheduled to take effect in under 30 days, and they are set to proceed unless an agreement is reached between the two leaders in that time. The estimated elements are these. Canadian households are believed to have absorbed roughly $2,300 to $2,700 in additional costs since the tariffs began. American households are estimated to be paying between $1,400 and $2,400 Canadian dollars annually, with a congressional Democratic fact sheet placing tariff costs passed to American consumers above $230 billion between February of last year and January of this year, averaging about $1,700 United States dollars per family. And the unresolved elements are these. It is not yet clear whether negotiations will produce an agreement before the deadline. It is not clear whether the tariffs will take effect at the announced rate and scope or in modified form. It is not clear how Canadian federal and provincial governments will respond if the measures proceed. And it is not clear how much of the new cost would ultimately reach consumers rather than being absorbed by businesses along the way. What I would watch over the coming weeks is any confirmation of formal talks between the two governments, any published detail on the full product list, any indication of exemptions, and any statement from Canadian officials about a response. Those are the signals that would tell us whether this dispute is heading toward resolution or toward another round of escalation. The deadline gives this story a clear structure and a clear clock, and that clock is now running. Thank you for joining me for this report on the proposed 50% United States tariffs on Canadian goods and what the estimates suggest they could mean for household costs on both sides of the border.
USMCA, although I think we're talking to Mexico and not the Canadians at the moment. You would hope that in the outcome of all this, the Canadians would not unfairly.
This remains an unfolding situation, and the weeks ahead should reveal whether an agreement takes shape before the measures are scheduled to begin. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you receive each verified update as this trade dispute develops.